So our next speaker is Emma Rothschild, who is the Jeremy and Jane Knowles Professor of History at Harvard and also Director of the Center for History and Economics at Harvard and Cambridge, England. There are many works of hers I could draw attention to, but I'll just point to two. Economic Sentiments, Adam Smith, Condorcet, and Enlightenment, published in 2001. More recently, The Inner Life of Empires, an 18th Century History. For those who don't know this book, it's a study of the Scots family. It's a micro-history for the digital global age. And Emma has told me that there's now a website which she will perhaps point us to, pursuing this remarkable Scots family around the 18th century globe. She is at work right now on a book on the transnational history of France, which has been a long-standing interest of hers. And she is going to talk today about another inner phenomenon, the inner shuddering in the French provinces.
Whenever I sit down, I know that it's the most technologically adept people who never use technology. So there's going to be a brief interlude while I search for some status or possibly a source. But it's not too bad. Great. So what I want to talk about is the obscure history of Enlightenment, a history of the Enlightenment seen from below. And this is a history that's been more or less buried out of sight almost a century after Georges Lefebvre predicted that the historians of the future would soon decide to see events from below and no longer only from above. It's a sort of history that's been crushed in the wreckage of quantitative history and also in the wreckage of post-colonial history. But the lives of individuals did change in the period of the Enlightenment in France, and the history of these changes is, at least in part, a history of human consciousnesses. So what I want to talk about in a very preliminary way is some new possibilities of a history of the changing ideas and sentiments of individuals who were not themselves enlightened or philosophical. And I want to illustrate this with a project that's at a very early stage and that's about a place and time that's been seen for a long time as the extreme of obscurity. The small town of Angoulme, immortalized in Les Illusions Perdues as a place of families as immobile as their town and their rock, a scene of printing at its most unenlightened. Well, the region around Angoulme was one of the scenes of what Tocqueville called the first revolution in l'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, on the basis of what he described as the details of the administrative and financial history of the Ancien Régime. So Tocqueville's history of the decades before the revolution was an evocation, in part, of the ideas of the sect of philosophes and économistes and of the diffusion of these ideas in the larger society, to the point where they influenced, quoting Tocqueville, even the imagination of women and peasants. But it was also an inquiry into the social influences of the economy, the social consequences of economic change. That's Lefebvre's introduction to Tocqueville. In Tocqueville's own expression, each individual was anxious and agitated in his condition and tried to change it. There was a kind of collective inner shuddering, une sorte de tressaillement intérieur que n'avait point remarqué jusque-là. Well, these interior changes are ineffable and also, in a way, irresistible. But the traditional archives of economic and social history have been unpropitious, or so it seemed, for an inquiry into this sort of transformation. The records of births, marriages, and deaths are not at first sight enticing. Parish registers were, in François Furet's description, structurally numerical sources. Notarial records were non-numerical sources which are nevertheless serial and thus easily quantifiable in relation to endogamy, social mobility, income, literacy, and so on. This, you understand, is the early Furet. Well, the Angoulme project is a return to these old archives and to the other archives of history from below in the records of local criminal jurisdictions, lotteries from the militia, and the administration of taxes. Actually, the Limoges archives contain something which Darren would like very much, namely a lot of receipts for the costs of building big fireworks. But what I want to suggest about these records, and particularly the parish records, is that we don't only have to see them as a source of quantities to be dépouillé, or which literally means denuded, skinned alive in search of the structurally numerical. For the records that survive are more accessible in the early 21st century than they have been at any time since they were produced. The bundles of notarial minutes deposited in departmental archives are highly unlikely to be digitized on any substantial scale, and even less likely to be searchable. They're far too fragile, for one thing, to resist the austerity of industrial scale digitization. But parish and état civil registers have been reproduced on a very large scale, and in a few cases are searchable. This is one of the parish registers of Angoulme in the year 1764. I'm going to come back to this. And this is what the information in the registers looks like in a spreadsheet. The given names and last names of everyone who was baptized, married, or buried in the 8 central parishes of the town in 1764, their ages, their occupations when recorded, whether or not they could sign, where this was noted, and the same information where noted about the people who the parish clerks referred to as those close to them, relatives and friends. We've got a little over 1,400 names so far. Well, this is a demanding set of data for a small town, and it's not, of course, a complete record of the population even of these parishes in that year. For one thing, it's a record in the town where Jean Calvin wrote his Psychopanicia, the sleep of the soul, of events in the lives of Catholics. But the data is a depiction, among other things, of the social networks of the individuals concerned. These are the relationships of everyone who was listed in the registers for 1764. And these are, I put a slightly more interactive version of that online briefly. These are some of the relationships over the course of the 18th century of the signatories of a particular notarial document which was registered in December 1764. And actually this large 1764 project arose out of something very specifically about a particular document. So there have been 3 principal uses of parish registers by historians and family historians. One is to look at what Vauvel called the massive but anonymous evidence of literacy, illegitimacy, or abandoned children over lengthy periods of time, the enterprise of social history. A second, which is by far the most important use, at least for the survival of public archives in France and elsewhere, is nominative. It's the study of family trees, or the inquiry, generation by generation, into the ancestry of individuals who are now alive. A third, which is mostly the enterprise of local historians and archivists, is more eclectic. It is the search for traces of particular individuals, like the personnage de distinction, whose correspondence is kept in a separate folder in the Archives Municipales d'Angoulême. Well, the inquiry I would like to suggest, and that a group of people are making a small start with, is massive and also nominative. It's an effort to put together the large scale of parish data with the names of the families and friends involved, to revisit on the basis of new access to records, new technologies of data visualization, and new, and indeed not so new, ideas about social networks, Carlo Ginzburg and Carlo Poni's idyll of microhistory of 1979, with the name as the red thread in the labyrinth of the archive. And this inquiry can be seen as horizontal, in contrast to the essentially vertical character of family history. Who was my great-grandfather, or who was his grandfather's grandfather? It's an investigation of who was friends with whom, or who married whom, or who were whose children, of contiguity in time and space. But it is potentially vertical or historical in the sense of making possible an inquiry into change over historical time, which is, of course, a different and even more massive enterprise in respect of entering data and transcribing registers. Well, this is the project we've been involved in relation to Angoulême, and it's at an early stage in even the horizontal investigation or the depiction of 1764. So I'd like to illustrate what could eventually be done by using a variation of the eclectic local historian's enterprise. That is to say, by looking for particular individuals, although not individuals of distinction, in the parish data. And these are individuals who might be of interest eventually in relation to seeing the Enlightenment from below. They're not representative or a sample. Well, the first person is from the most familiar milieu of the middling Enlightenment, or the world of printers and booksellers. She was called Rose Rézé. She was born in 1730, and she came from a family of printers. She was one of 4 people in Angoulême at the time with the same name. This is one of the problems of small towns. The others were her 2 aunts and her first cousin. And she was the only one to enter, even fleetingly, into the historical record. As the plaintiff in a criminal case about a miserable afternoon when she was walking with her sister-in-law and the son of a neighbor insulted her, called her garce, putain, chienne, and tried to break her thumb. But looking for Rose Rézé in the parish registers does provide an overview of the social milieu of printing in the town. The family business was clearly part of the unmodern and unenlightened world of the old regime. The Rézés were printers to the Jesuit college. They had the contract to print municipal ordinances, passports, and tickets for the lodging of troops. One of the other Rose Rézé was married to the son of a master writer in the town, who was himself a writer to the navy. The family, as they can be followed in the parish registers, were much more diverse. Their occupations in the course of the 18th century included seller of playing cards, musician, cloth merchant, pastry maker, army commissary, and fashion merchant. Their connections in the town were wide. These are the 4 rows. I'm showing it to you against my better judgment at a very early stage. I was personally entering data just before I sent it to David. A citoyenne Rézé was later the proprietor of a cafe that was closed down during the Revolution as a scene of tumult and considerable excess. The Rézés were also downwardly mobile over the course of the century. In the first request for a divorce in Angoulême in 1792, the petitioner was accompanied by a Monsieur Rézé. 2 more of the early divorces were within their extended family, and that of their son-in-law, the writer to the navy. Well, the second group of individuals I'd like to illustrate with were from a more obscure milieu in the town. They were brothers-in-law. One was born in 1738, the son of a joiner's apprentice, and godson of a carpenter and the wife of a barrel maker. His mother was illiterate, and so were both her parents. The other, born 2 years later, was the son of a tailor. Both the grandfathers were tailors. The boys begin to appear as adolescents in the parish registers, signatories with cautious and elaborate teenage handwriting. In 1760, the older boy visited one of the Angoulme notaries, there was a great oversupply of notaries in Angoulme, so they were constantly doing contracts like for 5 livres between a beggar and the daughter of a beggar. Anyway, this was in connection with his widowed mother's tin forks. And he declared that he had, I quote, formed the design of becoming a master of arts to become a teacher. In 1763, he signed his own marriage record as a maître écrivain. In 1775, he was a teacher, the master of a pension or boarding school as part of the formerly Jesuit college. On his death in 1816, at the age of 78, he was head of the Bureau of Archives of the Prefecture of the Department of the Charente. His brother-in-law actually did become a master of arts, master of a pension, and eventually a régent or official teacher in the college. When he died in 1821, aged 81, he was described as ex-professor. His son was another of the early petitioners for divorce in the town. Well, the two boys were figures of the Enlightenment in the 18th century sense, or one of the 18th century senses, of enlightenment as a condition of being educated. And this is one of the banal contemporary senses, which hasn't been so much studied recently. Their own education, like their advancement as young men, was within the religious establishment of the town. They're an illustration of social mobility upwards within the old regime, and their social networks, as indicated by the baptisms and marriages of which they were signatories or godparents, were capacious. Their new lives intersected with the lives of their extended families, still artisans in the town. They're the two red figures. And the size, for those of you who know these, that the size of the node or the circle depicts how connected people are. Yeah. Well, the third and final illustration was a clerk in Angoulme, the principal figure or victim in an extraordinary affair that made an astonishing noise. François Laplanche, a young man of 20, the son of an innkeeper, was appointed in 1771 as an assistant clerk, a commis aux écritures, in the office of the taille in Angoulême. In 1776, allegedly, he began to steal small sums of money. He became prosperous. 2 years later, the receiver confronted him, assisted by 3 local magistrates in full judicial robes. In Laplanche's account, he was imprisoned in the tax office for 3 days and 2 nights. The receiver charged him with theft and falsification of registers. He charged the receiver with calumny and unjust imprisonment. The inner rituals of the tax office were described in excruciating detail. Laplanche was twice sentenced to death and once hanged in effigy. The affair ended in 1789, after 11 years of litigation, with Laplanche's vindication. This, of course, isn't from the Paris registers alone. The case turned, at various points, on the practice of writing, on the respective graphologies of numbers and letters, including the question of whether the art of expert écrivain was especially conjectural and deceitful when concerned with Arabic numerals, which were infinitely simple, and on the social connections of Laplanche. Laplanche's lawyers argued that he was a being limited by nature, who had learned no more in his education than how to write and did not know how to calculate, and that although he came from a modest background, he had rich relations and friends whose generous presence explained his apparent prosperity. Laplanche, too, was a figure of the semi-Enlightenment within one of the institutions of the old regime, the collection of the Taille, that was most complicated and arbitrary in the theories of the High Enlightenment. He, like Rose Rézé, was connected to an extended family with the most diverse occupations, and this we can find from the parish registers. Woman's shoemaker, clerk in the Department of Naval Supplies, surgeon, shoemaker's apprentice, bonnet maker. There was even, again, Monsieur Rézé, who came with Laplanche's wife to visit him when he was imprisoned in the office of the Taille. Well, these are scenes of private and public life, or of the human comedy in 18th century Angoulême. But I'd like to suggest that they are, or could be, histories rather than fragments or glimpses, connected to a larger history of the Enlightenment by the individual's own social connections. The Angoulême project is at a very early stage, as I said at the outside. Angoulême is not even an especially encouraging subject for a study of this sort, because almost none of the records have been transcribed. The project needs ingenuity at this point and ideas, but it is an enterprise, at least, in the unsilent history of the obscure Enlightenment. Thank you very much.